Last winter, during the colder months, I decided to go camping alone with my dog, Ranger. It's something I will never do again. I had taken several days off from work. I needed space. I wanted silence, time away from everyone. I packed up my SUV with all my gear and drove along a narrow backcountry trail that wound deep into a protected woodland area. The path was poorly maintained. Snow and ice covered most of it. Tire tracks were scarce. There wasn't another vehicle in sight. After nearly 50 minutes of slow driving, I pulled into a small clearing off the side of the trail. It looked abandoned, like no one had parked there in years. From there, I hiked another 15 minutes with my backpack strapped tight and Ranger trotting beside me. Eventually, we reached a small open patch surrounded by dense trees. The snow was thick, smooth, untouched. No footprints, no broken branches, no signs that anyone had been there recently. That was exactly what I wanted. I dropped my pack, cleared space for the tent, let Ranger roam nearby while I worked. He stayed close, sniffing at tree trunks, pawing at the snow, bounding around in short bursts of excitement. I set up the tent carefully, drove the stakes deep into the frozen ground. Inside, I rolled out my insulated sleeping pad and a heavy-duty sleeping bag rated for extreme cold. I knew the temperature would fall well below freezing once the sun disappeared, so I dressed in layers. Thermal base layers, thick wool socks, a fleece pullover, a heavy insulated coat. Even after camp was ready, I kept everything on. Next, I gathered fallen branches and built a small fire ring. Once the flames caught, I fed it slowly until it settled into a steady, controlled burn. I cooked a simple dinner over the fire. Nothing fancy, just enough to warm me up. I sat on a fallen log and ate, while Ranger stretched out near the heat. The forest was silent in that deep winter way where sound feels swallowed, muted, almost erased. My father once told me snow absorbs noise, makes the world feel smaller, quieter. After I finished eating, Ranger suddenly jumped up and began barking toward the trees. At first, I wasn't worried. Deer were common in that area. He had barked at them before. I told him to settle down. After a moment, he did. He sat back near the fire. I checked the time, decided to stay up a little longer before turning in. Whenever I camped in remote areas, I carried a handgun. It rested in a holster at my side, just like always. At that point, I still felt calm. About 20 minutes later, Ranger started barking again, louder, sharper. Then I heard it. Footsteps, crunching through snow somewhere in the darkness beyond the firelight. I stood up slowly, listened. The footsteps stopped, then resumed. Ranger shifted from barking to a low growl. Then, suddenly, he went completely silent. He stood stiff, staring into the trees. That's when a wave of unease washed over me. I followed his line of sight and saw a shape at the edge of the tree line. Someone was standing there, half concealed in shadow, just barely illuminated by the flicker of the fire. I called out, telling him he startled me. Told Ranger it was okay. The figure didn't move at first. Then he stepped forward slightly, just enough for me to make out that it was a man. He asked what I was doing out there, that far into the woods. His voice carried no warmth. I explained that I was just camping, getting away for a few days with my dog. He didn't answer right away. He just stood there, watching. Something about it felt wrong. I calmly told him I was armed. He let out a faint, dry laugh, made a remark about how I was threatening him instead of inviting him to join me, asked where my hospitality had gone. Then he turned and walked back into the darkness. The crunch of his footsteps faded deeper into the forest. I stood there long after he disappeared, staring at the tree line. Ranger pressed close to my leg. I didn't like any of it. But eventually, I convinced myself he had left for good. I carefully extinguished the fire, shoveled snow over the embers, stirred the ashes until no glow remained. I didn't want the light drawing attention in the night. Waiting for the next part, I slipped into the tent and zipped it shut tight. Inside, I focused on staying warm. I spread out my insulated pad to keep the frozen ground from pulling heat out of my body. I kept all my layers on, pulled a wool cap over my head, drew the sleeping bag snug around my shoulders until only my face was exposed. One hand, warmer, rested against my chest, another near my feet. Ranger curled up beside me, his warmth doing more than anything else could. I lay there listening, or trying to. The forest was so quiet it almost rang in my ears. After a while, Ranger started growling again. Low, steady. Then I heard it too. Footsteps, crunching through the snow. They stopped. Ranger fell silent, but his ears stayed rigid and alert. Then the steps resumed. Closer now. Slower than before. They came right up to the tent. And stopped. Ranger let out a loud, desperate howl. I whispered for him to be quiet, terrified the noise would provoke whoever was out there. When he finally stopped, the growling returned. The person outside didn't leave. I could hear faint shifts in the snow. Subtle movements, the sound of someone adjusting their stance, waiting. I had my handgun in my grip now, but I didn't want to use it. I didn't want to threaten someone and then be forced to follow through. I had never shot anyone before, and deep down, I wasn't sure I could take a life, even to save my own. Still, I couldn't endure it any longer. I racked the slide. The click sounded painfully loud inside the tent. Then I spoke clearly, told whoever was out there that I was armed, that they needed to leave, immediately. Realistically, who else could it be? It had to be the same man from earlier. Silence followed, long enough to make my heart pound harder. Then I heard the footsteps again, this time moving away. Slow at first, then quicker, until the sound dissolved into the trees. I didn't unzip the tent. I didn't dare look. I stayed rigid for hours. Ranger remained alert the entire time. That was the only reason I eventually felt safe enough to drift into shallow sleep. If I had been alone, I wouldn't have closed my eyes at all. Even then, I barely slept. Just brief stretches before jolting awake again. When the sky finally began to lighten, I packed up at first light. No hesitation. No lingering. We hiked straight back to my vehicle and left. I have never returned to that part of the forest. And I never will. Encounters like that remind you how fragile safety really is. How quickly peace can shift into fear. You can never completely let your guard down. Over Independence Day weekend, I drove from Tampa, Florida up to Savannah, Georgia to visit a close friend, Daniel, who I hadn't seen in years. He was completing a legal internship and renting a house near the historic district. I was staying for the long weekend, sleeping on a couch downstairs beside a row of large windows. The drive was smooth, easy. That evening, after I arrived, we played a few rounds of pickleball before sunset. Later that night, I headed downstairs to the couch. The windows faced another apartment building across the way, along with a maze of narrow alleyways. There was also an abandoned house directly across the street. Dark, hollow. The next morning, we played more pickleball, grabbed food, and eventually made our way to the main open-air market downtown. We wandered through the stalls and drifted toward the waterfront near the docks. That's when we noticed him. A man dressed in what looked like a wedding suit was slowly shuffling along the road near the water. He wore a sharp bow tie, polished dress shoes. His suit looked freshly pressed, almost pristine. He had long, dark curls and a sun-kissed complexion. The market behind us buzzed with noise, music, laughter, vendors calling out. Yet this man moved alone, detached, as if the world around him didn't exist. He didn't glance at us, didn't acknowledge anyone. If we had crossed the street as planned, we would have walked straight into him. Something in me resisted. I grabbed Daniel's arm and told him we weren't crossing. Instead, we turned right, heading deeper into the city, increasing our pace. He was moving slowly, so putting distance between us wasn't difficult. I told Daniel it felt strange. The man didn't look homeless. His clothes were too clean, too deliberate. Something about him was off. Daniel agreed. We kept walking. A few blocks later, on another crowded stretch of savannah, we glanced toward a storefront. And there he was again. The same man. Same suit. Same slow, mechanical shuffle. He was far down the street, diagonally across from us. But somehow, he had caught up. There was no clear path that would have allowed him to reach that spot without us noticing. I pointed him out. We both stared. It didn't make sense. Completely different area. Same movement, same expressionless drift. We eventually brushed it off. Told ourselves it was coincidence. The following night was July 4th. We watched fireworks from a small island, roughly 25 minutes outside the city. By then, we had mostly pushed the suited man out of our minds. We assumed he was just an eccentric local. Still, something about him had triggered quiet alarm bells. It felt misplaced. Wrong. That evening, we went on a ghost tour we had booked before my trip. It was my final night in Savannah, July 6th. The city was overflowing with people. A warm Saturday night. Crowds everywhere. Restaurant lights spilling onto cobblestone streets. That historic charm amplified after dark. We finished the tour and began walking back through the heart of downtown. Restaurants buzzing, bars alive, music drifting through the humid air. Waiting for the next part. The street was packed. A surge of people was moving toward us, fast and loud. As the crowd rolled closer, Daniel and I noticed the same thing at the exact same moment. It was him. The same man. The same formal suit. The same bow tie. The same dark, curly hair. He was drifting through the center of the crowd as if someone had placed him there. He stood out instantly. His movement didn't match anyone else's. Everyone around him walked with purpose, natural rhythm. He shuffled. Slow. Mechanical. He didn't blend in. Not even a little. Strangely, no one reacted to him. Two people brushed right past him, shoulder to shoulder, and didn't even flinch. He slipped between them without resistance, still moving at that same eerie pace, while the world flowed normally around him. For a brief second, he looked directly at us. Then he continued forward. It was like he was carried by the crowd, but not truly part of it. Daniel and I exchanged a stunned glance. Neither of us said anything right away. Didn't make sense. He didn't belong there. And we both felt that instantly. We watched him move farther down the street. When the crowd began to thin, we could see him clearly again. Still shuffling. Still detached. He drifted into a darker side street and turned the corner. Gone. We weren't panicking, but we were deeply unsettled. The same man, the same suit, appearing in completely different areas of the city. Always alone. Always moving the same unnatural way. We both knew something about it was wrong. Later that night, we went back to the house. Daniel headed upstairs to his bedroom. I stayed downstairs on the couch. I shut the blinds and tried to fall asleep. Sometime deep in the night, I woke up to a soft tapping sound on the window. I froze. It happened again. A light tap. After a few seconds, I forced myself to move. I lifted the blinds just enough to see outside. Down the narrow alley, near the far end, I saw a man's back as he turned the corner. Even from behind, I knew. It was him. Just before he disappeared from view, he turned his head slightly. Toward the window. Toward me. The next morning, I told Daniel everything. I described exactly what I'd seen. He admitted the whole weekend had been disturbing. And he's not someone who jumps to wild conclusions. He's logical. Grounded. Skeptical of anything paranormal. but even he couldn't explain it. As for me, I tend to be more intuitive, more sensitive to certain feelings. That weekend stayed with both of us. Months later, we still talk about it. The man in the suit felt real, completely real, and at the same time, not. I drove back home to Orlando on July 7th, and I still see the image of him turning that corner, clear as day. I never used to double-check locks, never paid attention to the sounds of my own house. But that changed after 1 week last winter. I live alone in a small place I bought a few years back. My life is quiet, predictable. I work remotely, order groceries online, go to the gym late at night when it's empty. I barely speak to my neighbors. That routine made it harder to notice when something wasn't right. It started on a Tuesday, around 2:45 in the morning. I had fallen asleep on the couch with the TV playing softly. That's when I heard it. A dull thump near the back of the house, not loud enough to scare me. My first thought was that something had fallen in the kitchen, or maybe the house had settled. We all hear random noises at night sometimes, right? I muted the TV, listened. Nothing. I checked the back door. Locked. Then I went to bed. The next morning, I noticed something odd. When I opened the back door, the deadbolt worked fine, but the handle felt loose, like someone had twisted it too hard. I told myself I'd fix it later. The following night, I went to the gym around 11:30 p.m. like usual. I prefer it empty. Quiet. I got home a little after midnight. As I pulled into the driveway, something caught my attention. The porch light was off. I always leave it on. I sat in my car for a moment, trying to remember if I had turned it off earlier. Eventually, I convinced myself I probably had. Inside, everything looked normal. Still, I walked through every room before going to bed. Just a quick sweep. Something I had never done before. Thursday morning, my alarm went off. I picked up my phone and saw it was at 14% battery. That didn't make sense. I always charge it overnight. And I clearly remembered plugging it in. The cable was still attached to my phone. But the charger wasn't in the wall. It was lying on the floor. I stared at it. Maybe I knocked it loose while sleeping. But my phone was still on the nightstand, not in bed. The only explanation I could come up with was that I had picked it up half asleep, accidentally pulled the charger out and set it back down without remembering. It didn't sit right. After that, I started paying attention. That night, I stayed awake later than usual. I turned the TV off, sat in the dark, listened. Around 3:10 a.m., I heard it again. Slow thuds from the back of the house. Footsteps? No, that's impossible. I held my breath. The sound stopped. After a while, I convinced myself it had come from outside. I live in a suburban neighborhood. There are always people around, even late. The next afternoon, I found muddy shoe prints near the back door. Inside. The prints weren't clear. The tread patterns were smeared, like someone had tried to wipe them before stepping farther in. My stomach dropped. I just stood there, staring at them, trying to understand how they got there. I hadn't invited anyone over. I hadn't stepped outside in muddy shoes. I examined the back door more closely this time. That's when I noticed faint scrape marks around the lock, thin scratches, like someone had tried to work something sharp into it. I called a locksmith and told him I thought the lock was defective. I didn't mention the footprints. He arrived that afternoon, replaced the entire mechanism, and assured me it was secure. That night, I shoved a heavy chair under the back door handle. I locked my bedroom door too, something I had never felt the need to do before. Just before 4 a.m., I woke up. A soft tapping sound echoed from my bedroom door. Not a knock, more like fingertips brushing against it. Testing it. I lay completely still, staring at the door. My eyes burned because I refused to blink. The tapping continued for nearly a minute. Then it stopped. A few seconds later, I heard quiet footsteps retreating down the hallway. I didn't sleep again. When morning came, the chair was still wedged under the back door, but the back door itself was unlocked. The brand new lock wasn't broken. It hadn't been forced. It had simply been turned. That's when the truth hit me. I wasn't imagining things. I wasn't overtired. Someone had been inside my house while I was asleep, and they knew how to unlock the door from the inside. I called the police and tried to explain everything without sounding unhinged. They searched the house, checked the yard, looked for signs of forced entry. There were none. Of course there weren't. I had just replaced the lock. They gently suggested I might have unlocked it myself and forgotten. I knew that wasn't possible. But without proof, there wasn't much they could do. That night, I stayed awake with every light on. A kitchen knife sat on the table in front of me. Around 2 a.m., I heard a noise from the basement. The basement door, just off the kitchen, was slightly open. I felt a wave of dread wash over me. I stared down the hallway at that narrow crack. Slowly, I stepped closer. I leaned toward the opening and looked down through the thin gap, and I swear this was not my imagination. At the bottom of the stairs, maybe on one of the last steps, I saw the outline of someone standing there. Still, I couldn't tell if they were looking up at me, but they were there. The moment my brain processed what I was seeing, I slammed the door shut and ran. I bolted out of the house and into my car. Hands shaking, I called emergency services again. When officers arrived for the second time that week, they entered the house while I waited in the back of one of their patrol cars. A few minutes later, they brought him out in handcuffs. He was barefoot, wearing dark clothes that looked wrinkled and slept in. He never once looked in my direction. I don't think he realized I was sitting in the car nearby. They placed him in the back of another cruiser and shut the door. More officers went back inside. I refused to glance at him. My whole body was shaking. Even when I tried to speak, my words came out uneven and strained. The search took longer than I expected. Eventually, one of the officers came back out and asked how long I had lived there. I told him, several years. He nodded and scribbled something down. Then he asked what time I usually went to the gym. Which days? I answered. He looked back at the house and explained they had found food wrappers and empty water bottles tucked behind the furnace in the basement. There was also a phone charger plugged into an outlet down there. It appeared someone had been sleeping on the concrete floor, using old insulation as makeshift padding. The man hadn't said a single word. The lead officer told me the potential charges he could face, though ultimately it would depend on the county prosecutor. Eventually, they cleared me to go back inside. Days later, while scrolling through my camera roll to send a friend a picture, I found something that made my blood run cold. At first, I couldn't process it. It was a photo of me, asleep in my bed, taken at 3:12 a.m. It was from the same night I had woken up to find my phone unplugged from the wall. The nightmare started all over again. I contacted the unit listed on the incident report. They asked me to come in and transfer the photo digitally as additional evidence. Later, I was told that with this image, he would likely face more serious charges, possibly stalking, possibly even lifetime registration as a sex offender. Hearing that should have felt comforting. It didn't. Nothing changes the fact that he stood over me while I slept. Nothing erases that image. I will never walk into a basement alone at night again. Not for the rest of my life.